Ladies and gentlemen, British UFO researcher Nick Redfern is one of the world's top authors and speakers on UFOs and researchers on UFOs and the paranormal and things that go bump in the night. An expert on abduction cases, Nick is going to talk to us today about his new book, Top Secret Alien Abduction Files, What the Government Doesn't Want You to Know. So please, a big round of applause for Mr. Nick Redfern.
Thanks, everybody. As you can tell, I'm the one with the funny accent. If I talk strange, not much I can do about it. But well, thanks everybody coming out. Everybody having a good time? Yeah. That's good. That's good. That's what we like to hear. Well, what I'm going to do for you today is talk about something that is a little bit different and that maybe a lot of people don't know about. And that is the issue of alien abductions and what government agencies know about the subject. Now, of course, everybody's heard of alien abductions, and there's a lot of controversy surrounding them. Things like implants, missing time. But the one angle of what intelligence agencies know about this subject doesn't really get targeted very often by the UFO research community. But over the years, I've come across more than a handful of reports from people, from witnesses, from abductees who've had experiences being taken on board a UFO, missing time, subjected to medical experimentation. But then afterwards, there seems to be a degree of surveillance, if you like, by military and intelligence agencies. This suggests that within the government there is, whether a project or a program, that knows that abductions are real and are targeting and watching the abductees. And I think in part, as I'll go along, I think in part the government actually doesn't have all the answers as to what's going on when it comes to the abduction phenomenon. I think they know and realise that there is a genuine phenomenon, but they potentially don't really know how to handle it, and they're not really fully sure of the agenda behind the abduction phenomenon. So there are a lot of issues here which potentially place it into a national security perspective. From the perspective of, if you look at the cases, people are being kidnapped, taken away. That in itself could be potentially a national security issue. So what I'm going to do for you is give you some examples of how and why we can say that abductees are being watched, and also look at how this phenomenon actually began back in the 1950s with a group of people who came before the abductees who were known as the contactees. Now, just before I get to that, I'll just explain how and why I got interested in this subject. I guess I'm one of these people who has a deep interest in the UFO phenomenon, but I've never actually had a UFO sighting myself. But the reason why I got involved and got interested is because my dad was in the British Royal Air Force. He worked as a radar mechanic, and he was involved in several cases in the 1950s when at the military base he was working at the time. This was September 1952, and the base was called Neatishead. It was on the east coast of England, and the radar operators tracked these high-flying, fast-moving objects approaching the North Sea and the east coast of England. And at first the thought was, well, it's 1952, the Cold War, it's got to be the Russians planning some sort of sneak attack or just testing our defences. So fighter planes were sent up to try and intercept whatever these objects were, and the pilots said that as they got closer to these objects, they could see they were sort of classic flying saucer type craft. Clearly they weren't anything that the Russians were flying. Now this went on for 3 nights, and on the 3rd night everybody was taken into a room and basically told, you won't talk about this. And this was the pilots who'd gone up in the planes, the ground crew, the radar operators, and the radar mechanics like my dad. And everybody did stay quiet for the most part, and my dad didn't talk about this until the 1980s, sort of more than 30 years later, when he told me the story. And not just because it was my own father, but also because he was someone trained in the military to understand radar. So that really sort of caught my eye. And as I got older, got into my teens, I started to read books on the subject. And even at that age, I kind of thought, well, you know, if the government knows things about UFOs and isn't telling us, it's probably something we should know, you know. So, and I think that's an important thing to note, is that information on UFOs or alien abductions, if it's being hidden, then it's being done for a reason. In other words, government agencies don't just collect information for the sake of it. There's an agenda that goes along with it. So that got me interested in the subject of UFOs, and one of the particular areas that ties in with this issue I'm talking about today is the matter of the men in black. And that actually ties in with the abduction phenomenon, as you'll see. So what I'm going to do is go back to the early 50s, as I mentioned, with the contactee phenomenon, and explain how this sort of then mutated and moved into the abduction phenomenon. Now, I've titled it or subtitled it, Before the Abductees, There Were the Contactees. Now, for the most part, the abduction phenomenon, at least, in terms of what it means today, it wasn't really discussed in the 40s or the 50s pretty much at all. You know, we had flying saucers, also known as flying discs, back in the 40s. In the 1950s, they became known as UFOs. But throughout the 40s and 50s, there was very little talk at all in relation to the matter of alien abductions. Apart from one or two cases, and I do mean literally one or two cases, there were barely any reports in the 50s of people being kidnapped and taken on board UFOs and subjected to medical experimentation. But what we did have were the contactees. One of the most famous or infamous was George Adamski. And George Adamski was one of the earliest people to claim to have had very sort of close encounters with eerily human-looking aliens. He described them as looking very much like us, but with long blonde hair and could speak English. In other words, they didn't sort of fit the image that we have today of aliens, sort of the little short creatures with the big heads and the black eyes. There was no talk about that at all. Pretty much, apart from the long hair, if you were to put these guys into a suit, they would look just like us. So that was the sort of very different situation. Now, one of the intriguing things about the encounters that people like George Adamski claim to have had with the Space Brothers was that these particular human-looking aliens wanted us to disarm our nuclear weapons. The idea was that we needed to live in peace and harmony with everybody else, otherwise we would destroy the planet. So people like Adamski and many of the other early contactees very much became like sort of gurus, almost cult-like leaders in some respects. And they had a lot of followers, literally in the thousands, who hung on every word of the contactees like George Adamski. Now, I've titled this one, as you can see, We Come in Peace, Maybe, because in many of the early cases of reports of encounters with the Space Brothers, some researchers felt the stories were almost too good to be true. In other words, were the Space Brothers actually our friends, or were they just presenting themselves as our friends? And that picture that's up there right now, that's of the model robot Gort from the 1951 movie, The Day the Earth Stood Still. And if you've seen The Day the Earth Stood Still, it pretty much typifies the imagery of the contactee movement in the 50s. You had this very human-looking alien who lands his flying saucer in the United States and warns the world that if you don't get your house into a good state, so to speak, that we'll do it for you. So movies like The Day the Earth Stood Still really influenced the ufological era of the early 1950s. Now, you won't be able, unfortunately, you won't be able to see that too much, but this is one of the FBI's documents on George Adamski. As of today, or at least this year, the number of pages that have been declassified by the FBI under the Freedom of Information Act on George Adamski is 387 pages. That's how long his surveillance file was and still is. Now, the reason why I mention this, because what this shows, there's sort of like a precedent to the government watching the abductees, and that is, namely in the 50s, the government watching the contactees. So when people say, oh, well, the government doesn't watch people in ufology, that's just paranoia. It actually isn't paranoia. As I said, George Adamski, his FBI file is, and these are just the released declassified pages, is almost running up to 400 pages. Now, one of the reasons why Adamski was watched was because he claimed that these space brothers that he met were communists, and they basically told him to spread the word that communism was good and that we needed to drop our nukes and live in harmony with the Russians. Now, of course, this didn't go down too well at all with J. Edgar Hoover at the FBI, to say the least, you know. Now, if people like Adamski had just been sort of spreading the word to, you know, a few people on a Sunday afternoon in a library, the FBI probably wouldn't have cared or bothered at all. But that's not what happened. When Adamski's first book, Flying Saucers Have Landed, was published, it actually sold in 6 figures. You know, we're talking in excess of 100,000 copies of the book sold. And Adamski, as the author, was talking about how wonderful communism was and how we needed to follow the beliefs and the lifestyle of the aliens, of the communists. And that was the primary reason why the FBI opened these files on so many of the contactees. Other ones included George Van Tassel, Truman Bethurum, Orfeo Angelucci. They all had FBI files opened on them. So, as I said, this is important because it shows we have proof that government agencies were essentially watching very, very carefully and clandestinely, watching people who claim to have had face-to-face encounters with aliens, which of course is what goes on today with abductions, but in a very different fashion. That's another example from one of the FBI files on George Adamski, and you can see significant parts of it are still blacked out today through the terms of the Freedom of Information Act. A lot of people assume that the Freedom of Information Act allows you access to files on just about any and every subject possible. That's actually not the case. There are around about 7 or 8 different clauses within the Freedom of Information Act regulations which actually allow the government to withhold documentation for significant amounts of time and for various reasons. Now, does anybody know what that is? Yeah, that's right, giant rock. Giant rock is a huge rock, hence its name, out in the desert in California. It's just outside the town of Landers. And that was the site where a man named George Van Tassel claimed to have met aliens in the early 1950s. And hang on. I was hoping to get a light. Hang on. Okay. Well, if I was to sort of stand by that broken off part at the front, I would probably come maybe a third of the way up of that broken off piece. So you can see it really is a giant rock. Now, according to Van Tassel, he had multiple encounters out at Giant Rock, typically late at night, and where he would see these aliens and they would talk about politics and the future and the world and the state that the planet was in, very much like George Adamski. Now, whereas George Adamski wrote books and sold them in literally hundreds of thousands of copies, George Van Tassel decided to take a different approach, and what he did was to put out a conference on every year out at Giant Rock, and it would be like an open air event. People would bring deck chairs and food and drinks and sit outside and listen to the contactees tell of their experiences. Now, at the height of the Giant Rock conferences out in California, the audiences were literally in the figures of around about 12 to 13,000. Now, I mean, if you imagine that back then compared to, you know, the UFO conferences of today, 500, 600, 700 is a really good figure for a conference. A lot of people forget or don't know, back in the 50s, the Giant Rock conferences were quite literally getting audiences, as I said, 10, 11, 12, 13,000 people. And many of those contactees were also sort of championing the idea that, well, maybe communism isn't quite so bad after all. So again, that was another reason why people like George Van Tassel was watched by the FBI. Now, I got hold a few years back of George Van Tassel's FBI file. That runs to 320 pages. So if you imagine that, just the files on Adamski and Van Tassel combined are like this thick. And they make it clear that, you know, they monitor all the publications, and they'd have people sitting in the audience at conferences making notes. And, you know, it really was a period where just about everybody in ufology in the early 50s through the mid 50s through the late 50s was being watched very, very closely. That's a building that George Van Tassel built not too far from Giant Rock, called the Integratron. And the plan of the Integratron basically was to try and extend the human lifespan and to slow down the aging process. And that was something he worked on for a long, long time. And he was a very skilled, clever man. He actually worked in the aviation industry for a long time. But the Integratron, it's a sort of fascinating place because, as you can see, it's like a two-story building. You can see the door open, but it doesn't have any nuts, bolts, nails, or anything putting it together. It's kind of like one of those sort of wooden toys where you insert all the pieces together and the pieces themselves hold the construction together. And that's basically the situation with the Integratron. There's no nails, no screws, no bolts, no glue, nothing. Just every piece inserts to each other and it all keeps it in place. So he's a very, very skilled, clever man. And just the fact that, you know, he had this huge following demonstrated why the government was so interested and concerned about the work he was doing. Another example, the Aetherius Society, that was very much like the work that was being done by George Adamski and George Van Tassel, but it was an organisation rather than a one-man situation. Now, the Aetherius Society actually still exists. It was created in the UK in the 1950s, but today the headquarters is in Los Angeles, California, and that's actually the entrance to the society, which I took a picture of a few years ago. Now, the Aetherius Society, when their headquarters was still in the UK back in the 50s, they were being watched also by an intelligence division of the British police called Special Branch. And they were watching the Aetherius Society because the Aetherius Society was also talking about how the UK government should get rid of its nukes and, you know, we should make friends with the Russians and so on. And that's one of the Metropolitan Police, as it's known in the UK. That's one of the original files that have been declassified, and it talks about how Scotland Yard, which is the main intelligence division of the police force in the UK, Scotland Yard were very concerned that the Aetherius Society were trying to spread, quote, Russian propaganda, which is mentioned in the files. Now, a lot of this is just sort of Cold War fear, you know, and paranoia, the idea that people in UFO groups were going to try and topple the government by claiming that we all need to become communists. But again, it does demonstrate that in the early years of ufology in the 50s, a lot of what was going on did revolve around politics. Today, you know, UFO encounters, we just hear about the encounters, the sightings, the cases. Back then, there actually was this kind of political angle to it all. So again, we see not just in the United States, but in the UK, that some of the early people in ufology were being watched very, very closely as well. Now, that brings us to the issue of alien abductions and the idea that today, it's not so much the contactees, but it's the abductees that are being watched. And we don't know for sure when the first abduction occurred. What we do know, however, that certainly the most famous early case was the Betty and Barney Hill case of September 1961. And it was that incident, more than any other, that really changed things from the movement of the contactees into the realm of the abductees. Now, for people who don't know the Betty and Barney Hill case, it occurred in September 1961, and the Hills were heading back home after taking a vacation in Canada, and they were heading back to New Hampshire, and they saw this strange light in the sky. Didn't seem to be a helicopter, didn't seem to be an aircraft. They didn't know what it was. And it seemed to be shadowing them through the mountains and the winding roads as they were driving home late at night. And they both got pretty concerned by it. And so stopped the car at one point, and Barney got out of the car. And it was very sort of stressful and almost like a surreal situation. They had no idea what was going on. They continued on back home. I'm sort of condensing the story, but they drove back home, got back home, and found that they're actually missing several hours of time which could not be accounted for, and they were totally baffled. You know, the journey seemed to have taken several hours longer than it should have done. Then, over the preceding and following days and weeks, they started to have nightmares and strange dreams of actually having been on the craft and subjected to medical experimentation. And Betty talked about some kind of needle inserted into her navel, and Barney talked about how the aliens kept, it seemed to be like they were actually counting how many vertebrae he'd got in his spine, which is a very strange thing to do, but apparently they did that several times. And the story actually got out into the public domain, and in the 1960s, John Fuller, who was a journalist and writer, wrote a book on the case called The Interrupted Journey. And that book really, I guess, kind of opened the doors completely to this new phenomenon of alien abductions, which, as I said, really was totally unknown in the 40s and the 50s. And that's Betty and Barney there, and that's their little dog, Delcy, in the middle, he turns up in most of all the photographs of Betty and Barney. And they shared their story in conferences, on TV, and there's a movie made about their experiences. And there's no doubt, I think, from my perspective, that had it not been for Betty and Barney's encounter, we probably would not know anywhere near the amount of abduction cases and phenomena that we do have today. They really were the ones who kind of pioneered the whole thing. Now again, it's not too easy to see, but that's one of the Air Force documents on Betty and Barney's case. So far, at least, there are about 30 to 40 pages of official Air Force intelligence papers that have been declassified on the Betty and Barney case. Now, this is important because, so far as we know, this is the earliest official document or series of documents on alien abductions collected by US Air Force intelligence. Now, this was at the same time that the government had Project Blue Book in place, which was looking into UFO encounters. But most of the cases that Blue Book looked into were sightings of strange things in the sky. This whole angle with Betty and Barney Hill took things for the government to a completely different level, because they weren't talking just about strange lights in the sky or flying saucers in the sky. They were talking about US citizens essentially being kidnapped against their will and taken on board a craft and subject to distressing operations and experiments. And there's evidence, if you sort of read between the lines, that this was the point where the government started to realise that this was some kind of genuine national security issue. The idea of citizens being kidnapped and the government couldn't do anything about it. And not only that, the government didn't know why it was even going on. Why were people being kidnapping? So when you look at all those angles, you can easily understand why government agencies would then start to look into this. You know, if you took UFOs out of the component and, you know, some clandestine human group was kidnapping people, then, you know, the police, the authorities would be looking into it. It's kind of like that as a parallel. And I think when you look at all the data from this early period, the 1960s, you do find sort of a sense of almost fear within the government as to what was going on and their inability to understand it. And where was this agenda leading to? Why were people being abducted? And then, of course, you had started to get stories where people claimed that they had been implanted with strange devices into their head or their nostril. And this angle of alien implants really sort of rose the paranoia, if you like, and concern to even greater levels. The idea that not only were and are people being kidnapped, abducted and experimented on, but now they're being implanted with small devices in their bodies. And when that angle got to the government, and there's good evidence from a number of whistleblower type characters and elderly people within government, now retired, have said that that was one of the key issues that had at least some people in the government very, very concerned. The idea of people being implanted. You know, was it to track people, or was it possible that there could be some sort of device that switched on would turn them into sort of mind-controlled robots almost, you know? So there were a lot of bizarre theories floating around the Pentagon and the Department of Defense as to what was going on. But certainly it all began with Betty and Barney Hill. Now, one of the other weirder aspects to all this is the phenomenon of black helicopters. Now, the black helicopter phenomenon is one that plays a significant, large role in the overall UFO phenomenon. There are a number of very credible cases where UFOs have been seen in the same proximity as black helicopters. A classic famous case from Texas, December 1980, when two women and a young boy, you may know the story, it's called the Cash Landrum incident, driving home late at night, and they saw this strange craft come down in the sky, not too far from Houston, and there was somewhere in the region about 19 or 20 military helicopters kind of following this craft. Now, whether the craft itself was a UFO or some sort of experimental US aircraft that had gone wrong, we don't know. But certainly, for all intents and purposes, it was a flying saucer. But it was being followed by all these double rotor helicopters, suggesting they might be kind of like a quick reaction military team. Now, there have also been a lot of reports of black helicopters in and around the sites of cattle mutilations, as if the pilots, their agenda is to sort of keep watch on who is doing the mutilating of these cattle on massive scales, and particularly so in the 1970s. But I think for me at least, the most sort of eye-opening aspect of the black helicopter phenomenon is its relationship to alien abductions. And what I mean by that is that many people who have had abduction experiences, and particularly those who've written books or articles and are sort of, being profiled in relation to abductions and UFOs, they have been, best way I can describe it is sort of harassed by whoever's flying these black helicopters. And many people have come forward claiming in the immediate aftermath of an encounter, an abduction experience, taken on board a UFO, in the immediate aftermath, they have seen large black helicopters right over their homes and flying at really low, dangerous levels, almost as if it's some sort of attempt to frighten people, to intimidate them, possibly even to silence them. And there are so many reports of these on record that it clearly is not, it is not a coincidence. There's something going on here. But of course, the big question is, how is it that the guys who are flying these helicopters, how do they know who to target and where? So this kind of suggests that there is a large database somewhere of the names, the addresses, the locations of the abductees to allow the helicopter pilots to zoom in on them. But there's an even weirder aspect to this. Many of the abductees have said that on occasion the black helicopters that they've seen have actually, in front of their eyes at sort of a height of 400 or 500 feet, sometimes they've just quite literally like vanished into nothing, they're just completely gone. Or they've sort of morphed into the shape of a flying saucer. In other words, as if the helicopter, one of the theories is it's almost like a stealth type craft that can change its form or almost camouflage itself to look like a helicopter when it may be a flying saucer, which really does sound bizarre and strange. But the fact is that is what people describe. So many of the abductees have said, we were looking at the helicopter and then it suddenly started to shimmer and change, and it really took on the form of a flying saucer. So again, we see another growing aspect of the abduction phenomenon with the introduction of the black helicopters. Now, probably the strangest aspect of all this is how the abduction phenomenon ties in with the men in black. Now, if you mention the men in black to people outside of our community, outside of ufology, the first thing most people think of is Will Smith and Tommy Lee Jones, because the movies were so popular and all around the world. In one sense, the movies were good, fun entertainment, and they did sort of bring to the attention of just about everybody, the idea or the concept of the men in black. And, if you ask anybody outside of ufology, who are the men in black, people will say, oh, they're those people who silence people who've seen UFOs. Everybody kind of knows that. But certainly for the vast majority of the general public, most people don't know how the Men in Black mystery actually began and how and why it began. Now, the movies were made in the 1990s, but the term Men in Black and Man in Black were actually coined way back in the early 1950s. That's how far back this phenomenon of the Men in Black goes. Now, in the movies, Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith's characters work for a secret agency within the government that responds to UFO events, and that includes alien abductions. But if you go back and look at the original stories, the real Men in Black actually don't come across as being entirely human. And by that I mean that many of the witnesses who've seen the Men in Black up and close have described them as having sort of skin that's almost like plastic, doesn't look like normal skin. And one person described them as looking kind of like a mannequin. If you think of a mannequin in a store, but dressed and talking, it would look pretty creepy. And people also talk about how their eyes seem to be slightly bigger than normal, and bizarre cases where they're wearing sort of lipstick and wigs to try and alter their appearance and look more human than they would or necessarily to begin with. And the phenomenon of the Men in Black began in the late 1940s with a guy named Albert Bender. And Albert Bender lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and he created a group called the International Flying Saucer Bureau, the IFSB. And he was an unusual guy. He lived in the attic of a creepy old house in Bridgeport, and he basically sort of changed the attic room to what he called his chamber of horrors. And he had all these sort of pictures of monsters and werewolves and ghosts and demons on the walls. And he created what he called his, excuse me, his, excuse me, he called it his paranormal altar. And he was someone who was heavily involved in the occult. And he essentially tried to open portals and doorways to allow or entice supernatural creatures to come through from the other side, so to speak. But he was also someone heavily involved in the subject of UFOs. But his primary area of interest was the occult. And he wasn't like just a dabbler in the subject. He was like a big follower of people like Aleister Crowley and a lot of other magicians and occultists in that particular period. Now, as I said, Bender essentially was trying to call things through, supernatural beings from other realms of existence. And I don't think it's any coincidence that shortly after doing this, that late one night, Bender was sitting on his bed and suddenly started to feel sick and ill. He felt lightheaded and dizzy and felt like he was going to pass out. So he lay down on the bed, and the bed was suddenly then overwhelmed by this odour of like sulphur or brimstone, which is typical of many supernatural and paranormal experiences. And he said that, unlike in the movies where the Men in Black knock on the door and threaten people, it wasn't like that at all. He said he saw three sort of shadowy, silhouetted figures that literally walk through the walls of the attic room and talking through talking in a telepathic fashion, warned him to leave the subject alone and never come back to it. And if any of you have heard of the shadow people, it's sort of like a subgroup within the world of the paranormal, where people see these shadowy figures. They wake up in the middle of the night, unable to move properly, and they see these shadowy human-like figures looming over the bed. And they're wearing sort of like an old-style fedora hat, like in the picture there. And I think it's pretty clear to me that there's some sort of crossover between the UFO subject and the world of the paranormal that allowed Albert Bender to kind of invoke these things to come through. Now, Bender essentially for the first few weeks decided he was going to ignore these threats from the Men in Black until they kept coming back and coming back and coming back again. Eventually he decided to shut down the IFSB and walk away from ufology for just about forever. Now, many people in ufology at that particular time thought that Albert Bender was essentially it was like a publicity stunt. Kind of the best parallel I can think of is, your favourite band says, we're going to go on our final tour, so you better all come and see us because then we're going to retire. And so everybody goes and sees the band play, everybody gets the tickets, the band plays, says goodbye, and then they come back again like 5 years later, and we got bored, so we're gonna start playing again. That's what a lot of people thought it was going to be like with Albert Bender, but it actually wasn't. He really did walk away from UFOs, and he actually only died 4 years ago at the age of 94. But had he not quit ufology and stayed in the subject, things could have been much worse for him. But his was the first defining case that really kicked things off with the whole angle of the Men in Black threatening people who've seen UFOs. And a significant number of people who've reported abduction experiences have talked about how not just Men in Black, but also women in black have turned up on their doorsteps, literally threatening them not to talk about their abduction experiences. Now, that particular picture there was one that I commissioned from an artist who, the picture basically details the encounter of a woman in Florida who had an encounter with something just like that. Now, the woman herself had had multiple alien abduction experiences over the years, and for the most part, that's all it was. It was like the abductions, the missing time, very sort of stressful experiences and so on. But this one is a little bit different because in this case, the woman was threatened on a number of occasions not to talk about her experiences, her abduction experiences. And on one occasion, well actually on several, but on the first occasion, a woman knocked on the front door and the abductee opened the door to see a woman looking just like that. And she described the woman, if she actually really was a woman, which I'll get to in a minute. You can see she got like long black hair in kind of a bang style. Now the abductee said it was clear that the hair was actually a wig. It was not real hair. She could tell that it was a wig. And as you can see, the chin is quite pointed as well, and a thin neck and little shoulders. Now, as the abductee said, if the woman was to have removed the wig, and she said the woman also had a huge amount of makeup on, so she thought if all the makeup was removed and she had a really pale skin and she removed the wig, and with those dark eyes that she got, she would actually not look too dissimilar to the so-called greys of ufology. You know, if she took the wig off and there's no hair, and she's really pale faced and got this pointed chin and black eyes, she actually would look like the familiar image of aliens today. And so this has given rise to the idea that perhaps some of these women in black, who typically do turn up like that in sort of long black wigs and that sort of pull around the side of the face, so it's difficult to actually see the face. The idea or the theory is that the women in black are now sort of infiltrating society and threatening the abductees by trying to pass themselves off as human, or at least to the extent they can. And there's like another example where a witness had seen like a flying triangle type UFO. You know, we have terms like flying saucer, flying disc UFO, but in the 1990s you had the phenomenon, or late 1980s onwards I should say, you had a lot of reports of what became known as flying triangles, these huge black triangular type craft that was seen all around the world and still are. And I've got several cases where abductees were taken on board these type of craft, and on one case actually encountered one of these women in black on the flying triangle itself, and the woman was on the bed, or the kind of like a hospital bed on board the craft, and saw one of these women in black standing next to her, just glaring at her on the UFO. And so this aspect of the women in black is quite sort of less well known compared to the men in black mystery. But when you start looking at the number of reports that do exist, I mean, I've probably got somewhere in the region about 70 or 80 to the point where I was able to sort of write a book on the subject called The Women in Black. And that's just the cases that I've found. You know, there could be numerous other people out there who've also found reports of the women in black. Now we come to not just the abductees themselves, but the people who look into the issue of the abductions. That guy's a friend of mine, Greg Bishop. Some of you may have heard of Greg. Greg's written a number of good books on UFOs. Excuse me. One is an A to Z book on the contactee movements, which the book's just come out a couple of months ago, and it's called A is for Adamski, and that's a really good book. And he also wrote one called Project Beta, which was all to do like a conspiracy book in relation to UFOs. And in the 1990s, Greg made friends with a woman named Carla Turner, and Carla Turner in the 90s was one of the major alien abduction researchers, and she wrote a book called Into the Fringe. And Greg and Carla, for a number of months, bear in mind this was back in the early 1990s when there was no internet for the most part, at least anyway, and so they sort of did things the old-fashioned way, sort of typed letters and stuck a stamp on them and just basically chatted like that. Now, after the first week or so of essentially just mailing letters to each other, what they found was that both the mail from both Carla to Greg and Greg to Carla, when it was arriving, the envelopes had been opened and resealed, but then there'd been no attempt to try and hide it. In some cases, the envelopes have been literally torn wide open and just covered in Scotch tape. And both Carla and Greg came to believe that the mail tampering, it wasn't just being done deliberately, but somebody was sending a message to Greg and to Carla to let them know that someone was opening the mail. In other words, that was sort of a way to sort of psychologically disturb people. If they didn't realise the mail was being tampered, they would never know. But actually letting them know that the mail was being tampered with kind of really sent both Carla and Greg into a bit of a sort of paranoid state for a while, which you can easily understand. You expect to get your mail out of the mailbox every day with no problem, only to find that between just those two individuals, their mail was somehow being diverted and opened. And although Carla died young, unfortunately, she was one of the major players in the 1990s, and she also was digging into this issue of how the military or the intelligence services were intrigued and interested in this subject as well. Now we come to the issue of Mothman, which many of you may have heard of, but you might wonder what on earth it's got to do with alien abductions. Well, the answer is quite a lot, and that's Mothman, the one with the wings. I'm the other one. And for people who don't know the stories of Mothman, I'll give you sort of the background first so you'll understand what it's all about and why it sort of, in today's world, comes to play in with the abduction phenomenon. Now, back in 1966, in October 1966, there was the beginning of a wave of sightings of a creature described just like that, like a humanoid figure with large wings and glowing red eyes, in and around the town of Point Pleasant in West Virginia. And it began with sightings just of the creature itself. Then, literally within weeks, there were reports of UFOs in the area. The UFO witnesses were threatened and visited by the men in black and also by the women in black. And just to sort of show you how things have changed today, Point Pleasant, kind of like Roswell, New Mexico, sort of really embraced this legendary mystery, to the point where every September they put on a festival in Point Pleasant to essentially celebrate the stories of the Mothman. And kind of like George Van Tassel's outdoor events near Giant Rock, California, every year they put on this festival in Point Pleasant, which attracts audiences of about 10 or 11,000. And it's very much sort of like a county fair, and it's sort of like a cool vibe, and they have bands playing and costume competitions and people selling Mothman t-shirts and Mothman baseball caps, and they even sell Mothman beer, which actually tastes just like normal beer, but I've tried it. And so the Mothman phenomenon began in '66 in this sort of strange, bizarre situation of this creepy creature, red eyes, almost like a gargoyle type creature descending over the skies of Point Pleasant. And again, that's sort of another example of some of the huge artwork in and around Point Pleasant. Now, that is one of the many bridges on Point Pleasant. And the reason why I bring that to notice is because in December 67, just a year or so after the whole Mothman issue began, one of the huge bridges that spans the Ohio River from Point Pleasant to the state of Ohio was called the Silver Bridge. And in December 67, late one night, the bridge itself collapsed into the Ohio River, killing 46 people who drowned because their cars slammed into the water as well, and they couldn't get out, and so they drowned. A number of researchers have suggested that the presence of the Mothman was kind of like a grim reaper. In other words, it was very much sort of a creature that would appear when disasters were about to happen, and possibly it would appear in a warning fashion, or the Mothman was the cause of the event itself. And today there's not really a firm conclusion as to which is the actual real answer. You know, was the Mothman an evil type creature that caused it, or was it there to warn people? We really don't know. But again, round about that time, you had contactees and abductees talking about the men in black and the women in black visiting them in Point Pleasant. Now, John Keel, who wrote a book called The Mothman Prophecies, which was turned into a movie in the early 2000s, John Keel started to get phone calls from his interviewees in Point Pleasant, and the responses basically to Keel were, you know, why are you sending your secretary out to interview me when you interviewed me myself last week? And John would say, well, I haven't sent anybody out to interview you. And they would say, well, yes, you actually have. It was your secretary. And he said, I don't have a secretary. I work alone. And it turned out that when Keel went looking, that whoever this mysterious secretary was, she wore like long black hair and bangs, a black outfit, and threatened the Mothman witnesses. So you have a very strange situation that again ties the men in black, the women in black, to the alien abduction phenomenon, and so on. And this is just one example of many. You have the Point Pleasant encounters, as I mentioned, with the Florida one, with the woman knocking on the door. There are so many cases now like this that what we're seeing is something is clearly almost infiltrating society. You know, it's not like just UFOs hovering in the skies or landing and zooming off into the skies again. We're talking about these, I won't even call them people, I would call them creatures, sort of prowling around town late at night, trying to pass themselves off as much as possible as human, but in many respects not doing actually a very good job of it. Now, just to sort of show you how the phenomenon of the Mothman continues to this day, you might wonder what that building is that I'm standing in. Well, back in the Second World War, in Point Pleasant, the military created this huge facility where they produced TNT, dynamite, to be used against the Nazis in the Second World War. And those old buildings are still there, and they're sort of like huge rounded igloos, and gigantic, like pretty much like the size of this room. Some of them, they're huge, and they still exist. And as you can see, people put graffiti on there like saying Mothman and things like that. So the whole issue of the Mothman really still kind of exists in and around town. It'll probably, you know, never go away, kind of like with Roswell in New Mexico. Now we come to sort of the strangest aspect of all this, and this brings things right to the present day. And in a strange way, it goes way back, or it parallels, if you like, the whole issue back in the 50s with George Adamski and George Van Tassel and the contactees, when they were warning people about the threat of nuclear war. And in a strange way, in a roundabout way, in 2017, everything went back to kind of, in many respects, to the whole contactee movement, where the government was watching the contactees. And what we see in 2017 is something almost identical with the government, or at least the intelligence community, watching a number of the abductees in 2017 for issues relative to nuclear war. Now, many of you may remember that in 2017 there was a lot of concern about North Korea and how they could particularly, or they would soon have the ability to launch nuclear missiles. And two of the cities that were mentioned quite often were Seattle and Chicago. And this sort of quite naturally and understandably had a lot of people concerned and worried, that North Korea is a fairly, sort of not an entirely stable nation, to put it bluntly. And, people were concerned, would they potentially just decide to launch one day and just wipe out a US city? Well, two strange things happened at that same time frame in Chicago. One was that a lot of abductees came forward claiming that they'd had like nightmares, what you can only call like nuclear nightmares in the middle of the night, and seeing this vision of like multiple cities just being destroyed and flattened. And at the same time, there was a huge wave of sightings of creatures eerily like Mothman in the skies of Chicago in the exact same time frame. So again, this was sort of perceived by many as the Mothman had come back and there was a looming disaster. And if you Google Mothman 2017, you'll find that there's actually been books written on the whole 2017 phenomenon as it relates to Chicago and these stories. And if you just Google Mothman 2017, you'll find the whole story. It's a fascinating story of multiple abductees having these nuclear nightmarish dreams in the middle of the night, and all of them, independent of each other and not really having any connection with each other at all. Now, in many of these stories, the dreams, if you like, that the people had, and bear in mind that these were all abductees. They weren't sort of just people who'd had UFO encounters or sightings, but they talked about how cities were just being completely blown apart. And maybe a lot of people don't realise, the sheer power of, the nuclear weapons today, that exist. If you look back to the Second World War, that's sort of an example. One of the atomic bombs that bombed Japan in 1945. Today's nuclear weapons, can quite literally flatten a city. And millions of people vaporized in a second, and I'm not exaggerating. That is the sheer power that they have, And so this idea that, that the people today who think, we can win a nuclear war, it's impossible. No one can win a nuclear war because neither side can launch theirs without the other side detecting the missiles being fired. And so, in other words, if we, God forbid it never happens, but if there was a nuclear war, civilization would be over. Everybody would be just destroyed. There's just no way for one side to beat the other. But in the dreams that a number of these people had, they had this image of like just complete devastation all across the country. And a number of the people who had these dreams claimed that in the dream itself, they were talking about how the Russians supposedly were able to make a sneak attack. And supposedly they did it by essentially sort of frying the entire US grid. Now, you might wonder, well, how could that happen? Everybody's electric goes out now and again. Sometimes, it just might be your house, could be the street, it could be the entire town. But there's a phenomenon known as EMP, which is electromagnetic pulse phenomena. Now, an electromagnetic pulse weapon, essentially, when it's targeted, it can just wipe out entire electrical grids, and across the entire country. And a number of people the abductees who had these experiences said when they looked into it and started to research their dream, and how in the dream the country itself was plunged into this situation of the entire grid going out, and then the Russians launching a sneak attack, people started to think, wow, these are sort of EMP type attacks. And a number of those same abductees put their stories and their dreams onto social media and talking about it, and somebody else said, well, I had a dream almost identical to yours, and I also dreamed of seeing this Mothman type creature hovering over the skies of Chicago. And a number of these abductees who put their stories on social media were actually visited by US intelligence personnel, not, I should stress, not in like a sinister or threatening way, but in a concerned way. And several of them actually put their story, the follow-up stories about the visits, and how they were sort of asking the abductees, well, can you tell us what you saw in this dream? And they basically said, yes, there was a Third World War and we lost. And they were like, well, why did we lose? And they said, well, because the Russians were able to use an EMP weapon to shut down the US grid, so we would not have the ability to use the missiles to fire back. And, you know, it's a very disturbing story, because in the one sense, the government people who came out, when the witnesses, when the abductees started talking about EMP weapons, one of the women said that the guy who'd come to visit her, his jaw almost dropped. And she got this feeling that this wasn't the first time he'd heard a story like this. Now, you know, it's important to note, I mean, these were nightmares, you know, and thankfully this hasn't happened yet, and hopefully it'll never will. And as I said, it wasn't a case of these witnesses, the abductees, being threatened or intimidated. It was actually as if, you know, the agents that had gone out actually wanted their help. You know, can you help us to try and figure why so many people are having these apocalyptic dreams about Chicago? Why are they all so similar? Why couldn't we fight back? That kind of thing. So again, this kind of takes us back to the whole contactee movement and nuclear weapons, but it also kind of ties in with the whole angle of Mothman being present also in Chicago. And at the same time, you know, you've got the nuclear nightmare dreams, you've got Mothman, you've got the government agencies going out and interviewing people, all in this very, very brief period of round about July to about September 2017. And, you know, we're sort of talking now 2 years later and nothing has happened. And maybe sometimes, you know, just a bad dream is a bad dream. And perhaps certainly for the people in Chicago, you know, when there was this talk of potential attacks, you could understand why a lot of people would have been deeply concerned by this. So maybe sometimes a dream is just a dream, you know, we shouldn't over address it. But then on the other hand, you know, there were some genuinely weird tie-ins, as I said, Mothman, Abductions, Men in Black, government agents, and the atomic angle, which also goes back to the 1950s. Now, people often ask me, based on all the sort of work that I do and research, have I ever sort of been on the sort of receiving end of intimidation or threats? And well, I actually haven't. I've had a few experiences where it's made me think that I've been put under surveillance, but I've certainly never been threatened or intimidated or anything like that. But something strange did happen in March of last year, and that's a picture that I took, which relates to the story. I live in a two-story apartment block in Arlington, Texas. You can probably tell by the accent. And I was sitting just working on the laptop. It was about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You can see sort of a bit of a cloudy day, dull day. And I could hear this helicopter going over. And it just, you know, everybody hears a helicopter go over, but it was as if, you know, it wasn't going anywhere. The sound was constant. So I went outside, and it was literally, well, it was actually two of them. They were literally circling my apartment block. And that's one of them. And that's one of the others. You can just see, like, it's a cloudy day. But what's particularly interesting about both the helicopters is that both of them had no markings on them at all. Now, whatever the aircraft is or helicopter is, you know, the one thing they all have in common is the fact that they have codes to identify them, you know, numbers, names on the side. Neither of these helicopters had any kind of markings on them at all, and it's actually illegal to fly an aircraft or a helicopter without any markings. And as you can see, there's none on that one. That's the other helicopter, and not a single marking at all on that one. And you know, without getting too paranoid, it did make me wonder. You know, both of them were sort of flying around the apartment block, very, very low. I mean, you can see that from the pictures themselves. They're not a long distance away, and so, you know, that did make me wonder, because this was also at the time that I was doing some new research into the whole issue of the abductees being watched. So was it some sort of intimidation? I don't know. I can only sort of tell you the story as it happened to me. You know, I was working on that subject on that day, and then suddenly later in the day, you got these two completely marking-free black helicopters zooming around right above the apartments. You know, you can either look at it from the perspective of having a connection, or it's just one of those coincidences, which sometimes happen. But so, you know, when you then find yourself as being on the sort of receiving hand potentially of all this weirdness, it does make you begin to wonder, well, how far does this go? You know, is everybody in ufology who writes an article, who writes a book, who lectures, you know, who's got a YouTube page, is everybody in ufology being watched? You know, that's one of the potential things that, you know, the downsides of the internet. You know, the internet is a great resource tool. It's great for social media, but it's also great from the perspective of agencies. It makes the job of monitoring people much, much easier. So, you know, I do sometimes wonder in those occasional paranoid moments if, you know, we really are all being watched to some degree, and, you know, how we should handle this. Can we handle it? Or, you know, is the government actually doing the right thing by watching the whole phenomenon? You know, a lot of people view the government as, you know, this dangerous, sinister organisation that we should be worried about. I actually don't think that. My view is that I think when it comes to UFOs, that the people who are clearly hiding the truth, I don't believe they're sort of, quote, the bad guys in simple terms. I think they have a very difficult job to do. I mean, if you imagine today or tomorrow you got a job working in the UFO program, and you're briefed, and your manager, the person who oversees you, you know, says, okay, you know, you're now in the program, and this is what we've got to tell you. Yes, aliens are real. Yes, they're coming here. Yes, people are being abducted. We don't know why they're being abducted. We don't know where they're from, and we don't know what they want, and we don't know what their agenda is. And maybe the government has been pretty silent, not because it's hiding huge secrets from us, because it actually doesn't have the answers, which in many respects for a lot of people could be more terrifying than the fact that the government does know what's going on. So I think the people, you know, for the most part, they're like the rest of us. You know, they cook out on the weekend, they go to a sports game, you know, they take their kids to school, but then they're sitting on this huge secret that in relation to their job. And so I think for them it must be a very difficult job to do, to sit on, you know, this huge, sinister secret that we don't have the answers to. So I think I understand why the surveillance goes on, but I think the human race really has the strength to be told, you know, whether it's good or bad or somewhere in between. I think, you know, we should be told the truth. And maybe the surveillance, to a degree, is being done to see how we are reacting. And maybe if we start to react to it more without hysteria and people not worrying about it, maybe the government will come clean and will understand the truth behind the whole phenomenon. So I hope that's sort of given you some sort of insight into how, you know, the whole issue of surveillance began in the 50s with the contactees, spilled over into the 60s with the abductees, and now in the modern era with even the government clandestinely approaching people who've had these nuclear nightmare dreams, trying to put a picture together with the abduction phenomenon. So it's a very strange story, but it's one that I think, as right now, there are no signs of the story stopping. It's still spiraling and going on. So if anybody's got any questions, I'll be at the table later on. And so, well, thanks a lot. Thank you. I guess we're done, aren't we? I think we've got time for a couple of minutes, yeah.
In the 90s, we were getting a lot of rumors and reports of Nordic-type entities, especially in Europe. And being from Europe originally, Britain, have you been aware of any continuation of that? Is it still going on, or has it changed?
Oh yeah, that's a good point. I mentioned, like, in the beginning that a lot of the aliens that were seen in the 50s were known as like the Nordic types, long hair and very human looking. There aren't as many cases as there used to be in the 50s and 60s and through the 70s, but I still get cases now and again, you know, where somebody's seen a UFO and the aliens are nothing like the greys, you know, with the big heads and the black eyes. They really do look human. But I have to admit that those cases that I get, they're really rare. You know, it might be 2 a year or something like that. So, yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned the EMP, because actually the president just signed the executive order on March 29th, a few days ago, to actually start protecting the grid now. So maybe whoever government was actually nightmares. I mean, they might take it seriously, to be honest.
Well, yeah, I mean, the EMP weaponry, if used, you know, in the wrong way, from our perspective, you know, can be disastrous. I mean, you imagine an entire city just rendered with no electricity, nothing. Even car engines would be blown out, everything. You know, there'd be no ability to do anything that involves electricity, the internet, nothing. So, you know, that's something we need to be aware of. The idea that somebody could hit us with an EMP weapon and then render us not to have an inability to fight back. So, you know, it is a potential dangerous issue, and the fact that so many abductees seem to know something about this, you know, to me that actually comes across as a good thing, almost as if we're being, you know, warned to just be aware of that kind of phenomenon. So, yeah.
Would you say there's an increase or decrease in the number of reported alien abductions? The reason I ask that is because all we know about alien abductions are people who are either released or escape.
Yeah.
We don't know people. You know, there may be another number that you'll never hear from again.
Yeah, it's difficult to say how many abductions are going on, and how, you know, are there new abductees, because you know, we're reliant on those people to tell us. You know, right. If they don't tell us, we don't really know. So, I mean, clearly people still report abduction experiences, but I mean, to what extent, you know, the ones who come forward, what percentage of the overall number is, we'll never really know. I mean, I've written a lot of books on the Men in Black, and I get a lot of feedback And I think, had I not written those books, I probably wouldn't have got those stories. So, you know, we would never have known about those cases. So I think there's no real answer, I don't think, to, you know, how many abductions are going on unless they all decide to come forward, which
Are you
probably
hearing
not
about
going to
more,
happen.
though? Are you hearing about more now, let's say, 2 decades into the 2000s? Compared to the 1990s, 1980s?
Well, I have to say, I don't get as many abduction reports now as I did in like the late 80s, early 90s. I don't get, there's definitely a drop-off, but I don't know if it's a drop-off of cases or it's just a drop-off of people reporting it, you know, or it might be a bit of both. All right, thanks everybody. Thank you. Thanks.